India is the fourth largest carbon emitter after China, the US, and the European Union, and has set a target of net zero emissions by 2070. Arunabha Ghosh is the head of one of Asia's leading climate think tanks. He was appointed to be the South Asia Envoy to COP30. Ghosh is founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, based in New Delhi. As a special envoy, he joins delegates from nearly 200 nations, meeting at the 30th UN Climate Change Conference, known as COP30. This year's meeting takes place in Belém, Brazil, known as the gateway to the Amazon. Delegates work to provide long-term funding for climate resilience. They also try to establish targets for climate adaptation and aim to phase out fossil fuels while scaling up renewable energy. I met Ghosh earlier this year in Chicago at the Aspen Ideas Climate Gathering. When we think about COP, we think about the big players like the US, China, India. Each one has their own issues that they have to deal with, but there are always big players at these gatherings. Describe the situation with climate change in India today. How would you define it?
Well, Mike, India is already one of the world's most vulnerable countries when it comes to climate change. It's impacting us in various different ways. I call it a combination of the acute stresses and the chronic stresses. At an acute end, we see a rise in what I call hydrometeorological disasters. So floods, droughts, cyclones, storm surges, sometimes a combination of all of these in the same, within a single year in the same region. So my organization, CEW, we're developing the first high-resolution climate resilience atlas for India. And we've identified that three quarters of our 700-odd districts are already hotspots for extreme climate events. What does that actually mean? It means that lives are vulnerable and livelihoods are vulnerable. Take, for example, rains. I've just come from India. Our rainy season has begun. About 70% of all rainfall in India falls within a 3-month cycle in the summer rains. But we are noticing that over 60% of our sub-districts, we have more than 4,500 sub-districts, more than 60% of those sub-districts are seeing an increase in the intensity of rainfall. So while overall rain is good for a hot, arid country, but if it comes in shorter bursts, in a quick duration, then it basically overwhelms the urban infrastructure, but it can also be bad for agriculture. At the same time, on the flip side, there's heat stress. So more than about 57% of our districts are now facing extreme heat stress. That means, your productivity of labor goes down when you're working outdoors. Your crop yields might go down. So these are all ways in which we are facing the crisis as we speak.
Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva said Belém, Brazil was selected as the host city for COP30 so people attending could be amazed by the riches of the Amazon. Talk to me about the preparation to go into COP30. You're an envoy for a region. You go in, you've got to have a lot of different sensibilities. What's that like, the pressure of something like that?
Well, again, trying to listen and learn from people. So just last week I was in Sri Lanka, which is a small island nation in South Asia, trying to understand the concerns of small island nations inundated by rising sea levels, but also the imperative of having to build out cleaner energy infrastructure. But also in South Asia, we have mountainous countries like Nepal and Bhutan. So the vulnerability of the Himalayan ecosystem will matter to them. Glacier melt. So I'm right now in a lot of a listen mode, trying to organize consultations, reaching out to folks in the region, trying to understand their concerns, where the money is flowing, why is it not flowing. And I'll try and bring all of those stories, those narratives, those concerns, those demands, but also those ideas to the table and see what can be delivered for them.
A series of United Nations reports agree that limiting global temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels will help the world avoid the worst climate impacts and allow the planet to remain livable. But the UN has found that current policies are not doing enough and will lead to 3.1 degrees in warming by the end of the century. It was interesting. I saw you accepting your award when you won the Asia Game Changer Award, and you said about the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water that you've been able to create markets where none existed. So describe for me this journey. What did India look like then? What does it look like now? How much progress have we seen?
Well, in some ways, there's been a lot of progress, and it's been exciting to be part of that journey. And when I founded the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water in 2010, exactly 15 years ago, we had less than 20 megawatts of solar. In that same year, India launched its national solar mission. Today, India now has over 100,000 megawatts of solar. It's the world's fourth largest country in terms of deployed capacity of renewables. Just last week, India crossed 50% of its entire electricity capacity coming from non-fossil sources. That was a target India had set for itself for 2030. We've achieved it 5 years ahead. That's basically about 11,000 people getting a wire into their homes every hour over an 18-month period. The world as a whole has 700 million people still without any electricity. To get them access to electricity by 2030, every hour, 11,500 human beings have to be electrified. So you get a sense of the scale at which these things are moving. And at the same time, we have to keep doing more and faster. We got to still build out hundreds of gigawatts of clean energy capacity as we build out an economy, which is the world's fastest growing major economy. So you need the energy to fuel that growth.
For the first time ever, renewable energy generated more power than coal. That's according to Ember, a global think tank working on the clean energy transition. In response to the news, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres tweeted, "The clean energy future is no longer a distant promise, it is here. We must seize the historic opportunity and supercharge the global shift towards a better future for all." Listening to you talk about what's been accomplished in 15 years, it's remarkable. And yet we feel like when we hear the climate story, it doesn't matter how many success stories we hear like this. You look at it and you're like, is there hope? I mean, and obviously you wouldn't go to work each day unless you felt there was hope, but it does seem so daunting. Why is it that basically the narrative is, oh my God, it's this oncoming train. What do we do? And how do we change it to where it's more of a positive conversation like you're having?
Well, I think the negative or the positive or the hope or the despair has to be still grounded in evidence. And I think it's important not to let our biases, wherever we come from, cloud that judgment. Now, where do we look for in terms of evidence? The first is, where is energy demand going to come from? Nearly 90% of additional electricity demand across the world will come from developing countries and emerging markets. I'll give you an example. In rural India, using distributed energy for livelihood activities, say on-farm or off-farm food processing, milk chilling, small textiles units, if you put it all together, that's potentially a $50 billion market. And that's not pocket change at all, right? So you begin to see that even at the proverbial bottom of the pyramid, there is a huge scale and huge potential of what's possible. The third thing then is the jobs angle associated with this. We estimate about 3.5 million jobs by 2030 alone from the clean energy story. So when you begin to put these pieces together, you see that the energy transition story, the economic growth story, and the job story can actually be brought together in a jobs growth and sustainability mantra, not as an ideology, but something that you can actually create with some deliberate policy and market intervention.
So the climate change conversation should become an economic conversation in some respects, because I think for the longest time, that's been the fears, like this is going to mess with my economy, right? Is that basically changing the conversation, moving in that direction?
I think it is. I mean, it's always been an economic conversation, except, as you rightly said, for at least 2.5, 3 decades since the UNFCCC, the UN Convention on Climate Change, was signed in the early 90s, many countries across the world instinctively thought that this would be bad for the economy. And there's been growing realization over the last decade, I would say, that this can also be good for the economy. In terms of where technology is headed, where new investment is going. Last year, India invested about $50 billion in various aspects of the energy transition. China has deployed more clean energy infrastructure than the rest of the world combined last year. So when you see that these fast-growing economies are investing in still an emerging sector, you have to ask yourselves, why are they doing this if it weren't making sense for the economy? The other aspect of this is that the nature of what economic growth is itself is evolving. In one state in India, we did some analysis, Odisha, it's often impacted by storm surges and cyclones in the east of the country. And we found that one state alone, the green economy, is a $42 billion investment opportunity and can create 1 million jobs in that state alone. So the narrative is now shifting from environment versus the economy to sustainability as a driver of a new form of economic development.
COP30 set concrete goals and targets around climate action, among them tripling renewables and doubling energy efficiency, reversing deforestation and restoring land, and building resilient health systems. We've got some who say climate change is really a serious issue, and then you have a country like the United States, we're moving out of the Paris Agreement, which makes your job as an envoy to COP30 difficult, I would think. And you've got some that, like, we rely on fossil fuels. This is our economy. We don't want to make a change. I mean, these are all kind of issues that you'll have to deal with when you go to Brazil. Talk to me about that role.
Well, I think there are strong views for 2 reasons. One, because of people and countries' existing realities. Some countries are dependent on fossil fuels because they export them. And some countries are dependent on fossil fuels because that's the infrastructure they have today. The other reason that there are strong views is that even if there were a desire to shift to a different system, the past 2 or 3 decades haven't given them that reason to hope that the technology or the finance, the investment will flow to their economies. So what's happening is we go into these negotiations and every year we are expected to ramp up ambition. We'll say, we're committing to do more. We're committing to do more. And I've called this on previous occasions sort of a mutual backslapping society. Despite the very fractious negotiations that happen, everyone celebrates when more ambition is promised. But no one really takes a hard look at how much of those ambitions got converted into action. So I think the first message I would like to take as Special Envoy is that we've got to focus more on where the action is already happening. And that's why the examples I was giving earlier of emerging markets where the leapfrog is evident. My own country, which has now achieved at least one of its nationally determined contributions, the 50% of non-fossil capacity by 2030, 5 years ahead of schedule. These are the areas where the spotlight needs to shine. The second thing that needs to happen is, for the ambitions that have not yet been fulfilled, we've got to start thinking about specific avenues, specific vectors through which you can do that. And I call them sectoral deals. Can a group of countries focus on how to have the cleanest building materials? Someone else, another group of countries looking at greening steel production. Another group of countries looking at something else that's related to their economic structure. That helps to bring like-minded countries closer together in a faster action mode. A third thing that has to happen is recognizing that these vulnerable societies need help here and now to protect lives, to secure livelihoods, and to ensure their built infrastructure against the future shocks. Building resilience is harder because private finance tends to go towards, building something, a road or bridge you can touch and feel, rather than going towards preventing something. And finally, the most important thing is we got to shift from climate finance to climate investment. This climate finance is the public capital that is needed to then reduce the risks that private investment feels so that they can then ramp up the investments they'll put in developing countries. Without that, we're only chasing crumbs of climate finance rather than looking at the much larger pie of climate investment. So I think when we start putting these pieces together, it's an action agenda. It's what the Brazilian COP30 presidency has put out as well, a focus on implementation and not just promises. And we've got to rebuild the trust. Trust is something that takes years to build and very easy to lose. But the message ultimately is shine the spotlight where the action is happening.
The reason I want to ask about empathy, and I'm going to leave it here, I just stepped into a session over there. This woman was talking about dehumanizing, that people get so angry on this issue, especially here in the United States. But she said, we've got to stop dehumanizing. We've got to be we-humanizing. We've got to understand the other people and connect with them and try and find common ground. Otherwise, we're always going to be stuck in this cycle. And I want to get your thoughts on that because I thought it was a really good point. It's easy to dehumanize. They're wrong. I'm right. It's much harder to do what you're describing.
It's not just that we think we are right. We think the information on which we have based our decisions is the only information that matters. So let me give you a quick story. About a decade ago, I was in rural India, in a forest in southern India, and I came across this landless farm laborer, who had a thatched roof hut in the middle of the forest, but he had a solar panel on his roof. And I asked him, at that time, that one solar panel cost $400 in the exchange rate that we had at the time. I asked him, how have you managed to afford this when you're literally dirt poor? And he said, before solar, I was using kerosene for lighting. That was making my 2 white shirts dirty. So I was spending 50 rupees a month, at that time $1, on detergent powder. After solar, my shirts are relatively more clean, so I'm spending 20 rupees a month on detergent powder. Now, I don't know that farm laborer, political views, I don't know who he votes for. He was a widower, he had 2 young daughters, one was in nursing school, one was a high school student heading out to the city. But what I saw was something I've never seen since. No banker in Mumbai, in London, on Wall Street has ever come up with an investment plan for clean energy based on detergent powder savings. Right? But that's empathy there and then. If you don't listen to their lived reality and watch and live their lived realities in some ways, we can't come up with the answers we are searching.
Clean energy. There it is. Thank you so much. We're going to end it there.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you.